3 years. 1,095 days of silence from a boy who once filled every corner of the Montgomery estate with giggles and chatter. 3 years since Marcus Montgomery lost his wife in a car accident that left him wealthy beyond measure but emotionally bankrupt. 3 years since his 7-year-old son David retreated into a world where words no longer existed, where communication happened only through vacant stares and mechanical nods. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The boy who once recited entire picture books from memory now sat mute at breakfast tables that could seat 20, surrounded by staff who whispered their concerns in hushed tones. The child who used to beg for bedtime stories now stared at the ceiling each night, untouched books gathering dust on shelves that reached toward cathedral ceilings. In the sprawling halls of their Boston mansion, silence had become the family's native language, and Marcus had convinced himself that some wounds simply never healed. Until she walked through their front door on a Tuesday morning in October, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and stories that would change everything. The Montgomery estate stood like a fortress against the autumn wind, its Georgian columns and manicured lawns speaking of old money and older grief. Inside the master suite, Marcus Montgomery adjusted his tie for the third time, staring at his reflection with the practiced indifference of a man who had learned to function on autopilot. The mirror showed him what the business world expected to see: sharp jawline, steel gray eyes, the kind of presence that commanded boardrooms and closed million-dollar deals. What it couldn't show was the hollow ache that had taken residence behind his ribs 3 years ago and refused to move out. The sound of his phone buzzing against the mahogany dresser pulled him from his routine self-assessment. Another meeting, another contract, another reason to leave the house before David woke up, and another excuse to return after the boy had already retreated to his room for the night. It was a careful choreography they had perfected, this dance of avoidance that allowed them to exist in the same space without having to confront the crater that Sarah's death had left in both their lives. Marcus had tried, in those first months after the funeral. He had sat on the edge of David's bed, attempting to bridge the chasm with awkward questions about school and friends and whether he wanted to go to the park. But the boy's responses had grown shorter, then disappeared entirely, until they were sharing meals in silence and passing each other in hallways like polite strangers. The child psychologists had offered their theories about selective mutism and trauma responses, their clinical language wrapping around David's silence like bandages around a wound that refused to heal. So Marcus had done what he knew how to do. He had hired people. The best nannies money could buy, specialists with impressive credentials and recommendations from families whose names appeared in society pages. They came with structured activities and behavioral modification techniques, with charts and rewards systems and professional smiles that never quite reached their eyes. Some lasted weeks, others barely made it through a single day before David's passive resistance wore them down. He wouldn't argue or throw tantrums, he would simply sit there, staring through them as if they were made of glass, until they gathered their materials and politely tendered their resignations. Mrs. Patterson, the latest in a long line of failed interventions, had lasted longer than most. 2 months of trying to coax words from David through art therapy and structured play, 2 months of progress reports that documented every small gesture and meaningful glance as if they were archaeological discoveries. But even she had eventually admitted defeat, packing her supplies with the weary resignation of someone who had encountered an immovable object. That was how Marcus found himself reviewing applications from yet another agency, scanning through resumes and cover letters that all seemed to blur together in their professional competence. Degrees in child development, certifications in trauma-informed care, years of experience with challenging cases. He had stopped reading the details weeks ago, simply forwarding the files to Mrs. Chen, his longtime housekeeper, with instructions to schedule interviews. She had better instincts about these things anyway, a practical wisdom born from raising 3 children of her own while managing households that existed in the stratosphere of wealth. It was Mrs. Chen who had called him about Emma Rodriguez, the young woman who would be arriving that Tuesday morning for what felt like the 100th interview. Marcus had barely listened to the details, his attention divided between quarterly reports and the view from his office window, where David could be seen sitting alone on the tire swing that Sarah had insisted on hanging from the old oak tree. The boy wasn't swinging, just sitting there motionless, his small frame dwarfed by the elaborate playground equipment that surrounded him like monuments to happier times. Emma Rodriguez was nothing like the candidates who had come before her. Where the others had arrived in sensible shoes and conservative blazers, she stepped out of a cab wearing faded jeans and a cardigan that had seen better days, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that framed a face remarkable for its complete lack of pretension. She carried herself with an easy confidence that seemed immune to the intimidation factor of the Montgomery estate, taking in the marble foyer and crystal chandelier with the mild interest of someone appreciating architecture rather than calculating net worth. Mrs. Chen had conducted the preliminary interview in the kitchen, a breach of protocol that would have horrified the agency representatives who usually orchestrated these meetings in the formal sitting room. But something about Emma's presence seemed to shift the atmosphere of the house, making the cavernous rooms feel more like homes than museums. When Marcus finally met her, descended from his office with the intention of conducting a brief, perfunctory interview before rejecting yet another candidate, he found her sitting at the kitchen island sharing coffee with Mrs. Chen and discussing her grandmother's recipe for tres leches cake. The conversation paused when he entered, but not in the deferential way that usually marked his interactions with staff. Emma looked up with dark eyes that held his gaze without flinching, offering a handshake that was firm without being aggressive and a smile that seemed genuine rather than calculated. She was younger than the other candidates, probably mid-20s, with calluses on her hands that suggested she was no stranger to real work and laugh lines around her eyes that indicated she hadn't forgotten how. Her resume was notably different from the others. No advanced degrees in child psychology, no certifications from prestigious institutes. Instead, there were years spent working in community centers and after-school programs, references from families and neighborhoods where struggle was measured in missed meals rather than failed investments. She had grown up in East Boston, the daughter of a hotel housekeeper and a construction worker, the first in her family to finish college despite working 3 jobs to pay for it. She spoke Spanish and English with equal fluency, had spent 2 years volunteering with children who had lost parents to violence, and somehow managed to convey all of this information without making it sound like a resume recitation. Marcus found himself asking questions he hadn't bothered with in months, genuinely curious about this woman who seemed so different from the parade of professionals who had preceded her. When he asked about her experience with traumatized children, she didn't launch into clinical jargon or theoretical frameworks. Instead, she told him about Miguel, an 8-year-old who had witnessed his father's arrest and stopped speaking for 6 months until she began sitting with him during lunch, not pushing for conversation but simply being present while he worked through his feelings and drawings that gradually grew brighter and less angry. She talked about trauma not as a diagnosis to be treated but as a language to be learned, a way of understanding how the world looked different when filtered through loss and fear. Children, she explained, often stopped talking not because they had nothing to say but because they had too much to say and no safe place to say it. Words became dangerous when they carried the weight of feelings too big for small bodies to hold, so silence became a form of self-protection, a way of keeping the most precious parts of themselves safe from a world that had already proven it could take everything away. When Marcus asked why she wanted to work with David specifically, her answer was refreshingly free of the practiced compassion that had marked previous interviews. She didn't claim to have special insights or magical techniques that would unlock his silence. Instead, she said she understood what it felt like to lose someone who had been the center of your world, to wake up each day in a reality that no longer made sense because the person who had given it meaning was gone. She had been 12 when her own father died in a workplace accident, had spent months retreating into books and solitude while her mother worked double shifts to keep their small apartment. The silence, she explained, wasn't always about refusing to speak, sometimes it was about protecting the last conversations you had with someone who would never answer again. Marcus found himself studying her face as she spoke, looking for the calculated empathy that marked professional caregivers who had learned to perform caring as a job skill. But Emma's expression remained steady and honest, her hands folded calmly in her lap as she shared pieces of her own story without making them the center of attention. She understood that David's silence wasn't a problem to be solved but a wound to be honored, and that healing happened not through forced conversation but through the slow building of trust that allowed words to return when they were ready. The interview lasted longer than Marcus had intended, stretching through the morning and into early afternoon as Emma's questions revealed her genuine interest in understanding not just David's needs but the family dynamics that surrounded his trauma. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She asked about Sarah, not in the clinical way that therapists had but with the gentle curiosity of someone who understood that grief was as much about remembering as it was about moving forward. She wanted to know what David had been like before, what games he had enjoyed, what stories had made him laugh, what traditions had given structure to their family life. Marcus found himself talking about his son in ways he hadn't in months, describing the boy who used to build elaborate block cities and narrate epic adventures for his action figures, who had memorized every constellation in the night sky because Sarah had bought him a telescope for his 6th birthday. The child who had once begged for camping trips in the backyard and insisted on wearing his superhero costume to the grocery store, who had filled their home with questions about everything from why leaves changed color to whether dinosaurs had favorite foods. That David felt like a character from a different story now, a ghost child who bore only physical resemblance to the vibrant boy who had disappeared on the night his mother didn't come home from her evening meeting with the school fundraising committee. The accident had happened on a stretch of highway that Sarah had driven hundreds of times, a sudden rainstorm and a truck driver who hadn't seen her car changing lanes until it was too late. The funeral had been everything Sarah would have hated, formal and stiff and full of people who spoke in whispers about tragedy and loss as if volume could make the reality less sharp. David had stood beside Marcus throughout the service, small hand gripping his father's with desperate intensity, his 7-year-old mind trying to process concepts that adults struggled to understand. He had asked questions in the weeks that followed. When was Mommy coming back from heaven? Could they visit her there? Why didn't God need her to take care of them instead? Marcus had fumbled through answers that felt inadequate and hollow, his own grief so overwhelming that he could barely manage his own questions, let alone his son's. The silence had crept in gradually, David's voice growing softer and less frequent until whole days passed without him speaking at all. He still responded to direct questions with nods or shakes of his head, still followed basic instructions and routines, but the chatter that had once provided the soundtrack to their daily life simply stopped. It was as if he had decided that words were too dangerous, too likely to call attention to the vast emptiness that Sarah's absence had created in their world. Emma listened to all of this without interrupting, her expression reflecting understanding rather than pity. When Marcus finished talking, she was quiet for a long moment, not scrambling to fill the silence with reassurances or treatment plans but simply allowing the weight of his words to settle between them. When she finally spoke, it was to ask if she could meet David, not to evaluate or assess him but simply to introduce herself and see if he might be interested in having her around. The meeting was arranged for the following morning, a casual encounter in the garden where David often spent his afternoons sitting among the roses that Sarah had planted during their first year in the house. Marcus watched from his office window as Emma approached the boy, not with the purposeful stride of previous candidates but with the unhurried pace of someone who understood that rushing could break fragile things. She didn't kneel down to his level or launch into the animated introductions that other caregivers had attempted. Instead, she simply sat on the stone bench nearby and began reading from a worn paperback book, her voice carrying across the garden without being directed at David specifically. The story she read was unfamiliar to Marcus, something about a kingdom where all the colors had disappeared and a young artist who was trying to bring them back through magic paintbrushes and brave adventures. Her voice had a musical quality that seemed to blend with the afternoon breeze, rising and falling with the natural rhythm of good storytelling rather than the measured cadences of educational reading. She didn't pause to explain vocabulary words or ask comprehension questions, she simply told the story as if it were the most natural thing in the world to sit in a garden reading aloud to roses and butterflies and a 7-year-old boy who had forgotten how to speak. David didn't acknowledge her presence in any obvious way, but Marcus noticed that his son's posture had shifted slightly, his head tilted in the direction of Emma's voice even as his eyes remained fixed on the pattern of shadows cast by the garden trellis. When she finished the first chapter, Emma closed the book and sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, apparently content to share the space without demanding interaction or attention. Then she stood, brushed imaginary dust from her jeans, and told David she hoped he had enjoyed the story before walking back toward the house with the same unhurried pace that had marked her arrival. That evening, for the first time in months, David lingered at the dinner table after finishing his meal. He didn't speak, but he didn't immediately retreat to his room either, sitting quietly while Marcus reviewed emails on his phone and Mrs. Chen cleaned up the kitchen. When Marcus finally looked up, he found his son staring out the window toward the garden, his expression thoughtful in a way that suggested something had shifted in his carefully constructed world of silence. Emma began work the following Monday, arriving each morning at 8 o'clock with the same understated confidence that had marked their first meeting. She didn't attempt to impose structure or schedule on David's days. Instead, she seemed to orbit around his existing routines like a gentle satellite, making herself available without being intrusive. If he wanted to spend the morning in his room, she would settle in the hallway with a book, reading quietly within earshot but never pushing for acknowledgement or interaction. Her approach was so different from previous caregivers that Marcus found himself watching their interactions with curious fascination. Where others had tried to engage David through games and activities, Emma seemed content to exist in his presence without demanding anything in return. She carried books everywhere, pulling them out during quiet moments and reading aloud whether or not anyone appeared to be listening. The stories she chose were carefully selected not for educational value but for their ability to transport listeners to worlds where magic was possible and problems had solutions that didn't require talking about feelings or processing trauma. She read about dragons who collected books instead of treasure, about children who discovered doorways to parallel universes hidden in library shelves, about kingdoms where music could heal wounds and laughter could defeat monsters. Her voice transformed each story into something alive and immediate, creating vivid landscapes that seemed to exist just beyond the walls of the Montgomery estate. She never paused to explain metaphors or discuss themes. She simply told the stories with the kind of complete absorption that suggested she believed in them absolutely. David's response was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew how to look. He began timing his movements through the house to coincide with Emma's reading sessions, lingering in doorways or settling into nearby chairs with books of his own that he pretended to read while actually listening to her voice. His body language grew less rigid, his movements more natural as the days passed and Emma's presence became part of the house's rhythm rather than an intrusion into it. Marcus found himself making excuses to work from home more often, drawn by curiosity about this woman who seemed so comfortable in the silence that had defeated every other caregiver. He would find them in different rooms throughout the day, Emma reading in the sunroom while David worked on a puzzle at the nearby table, both of them surrounded by the kind of peaceful quiet that felt healing rather than empty, Emma tending to Sarah's roses while David watched from the garden swing, her voice carrying bits of conversation directed at the flowers about their care and feeding and the approaching change of seasons. She had a gift for making one-sided conversations feel natural rather than forced, chatting easily about everything from the weather to the books she was reading without ever expecting responses or acknowledgement. Her monologues were punctuated by comfortable silences that invited participation without demanding it, creating space for David to join in if and when he felt ready without pressure to perform or prove his healing. The first breakthrough came 3 weeks after Emma's arrival, so subtle that Marcus almost missed it entirely. He had been working in his study when he heard the sound of Emma's laughter from the kitchen, warm and spontaneous and infectious in a way that made him pause in his review of quarterly reports. When he investigated, he found her attempting to teach Mrs. Chen how to fold origami cranes from napkins, her fingers moving with practiced precision while she explained each step with the patience of someone who genuinely enjoyed sharing knowledge. David was sitting at the kitchen island, a half-eaten apple forgotten beside him as he watched Emma's demonstration with intense concentration. His hands remained folded in his lap, but his eyes tracked every movement of her fingers as she transformed ordinary paper napkins into delicate birds with spread wings and proud necks. When she finished the demonstration, she placed the completed crane on the counter and asked if anyone wanted to try making one themselves. Mrs. Chen accepted the challenge with the good humor of someone who had spent decades adapting to the peculiar requests of wealthy employers, but her first attempt resulted in what looked more like a crumpled tissue than anything resembling a bird. Emma's laughter at the failed crane was so genuinely delighted that even Mrs. Chen began giggling. The two women bent over the kitchen island trying to smooth out wrinkles and identify what had gone wrong in the folding process. It was then that Marcus noticed David's reaction, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as he watched the adult's futile attempts at origami perfection. The expression was fleeting, gone almost before it registered, but it was the first time Marcus had seen any hint of joy on his son's face in 3 years. The boy's attention remained fixed on Emma's hands as she demonstrated the folding process again, her movements slower and more deliberate as she narrated each step with the kind of detailed explanation that suggested she understood the difference between showing and teaching. When she offered David a napkin of his own, he didn't refuse, though he didn't immediately begin folding either. Instead, he studied the paper for several long minutes, his small fingers tracing the edges as if memorizing their texture and weight. Emma didn't rush him or offer additional encouragement, she simply continued her own folding, creating a small flock of paper birds that she arranged along the counter like a miniature migration. David's first attempt was careful and methodical, his movements precise in the way that children's work often is when they're deeply concentrated on getting something exactly right. He struggled with some of the more complex folds, his brow furrowing with frustration when the paper didn't cooperate with his intentions, but he persisted without asking for help or throwing the project aside. Emma watched his progress peripherally, offering gentle guidance through demonstration rather than instruction, refolding her own cranes to show particularly tricky steps without making David feel incompetent or rushed. When he finally completed his first crane, the result was slightly lopsided and bore the creases of multiple attempts, but it was recognizably a bird. David held it carefully, turning it over in his small hands as if examining a precious artifact, his expression serious and focused in a way that suggested the accomplishment meant more to him than a simple craft project. Emma praised the crane's unique character and sturdy construction, pointing out details that showed David's careful attention to the folding process without making the praise feel condescending or false. The origami session lasted for over an hour, far longer than David usually spent on any single activity, and resulted in a small collection of paper birds in various stages of success. Emma suggested they could make more tomorrow if David was interested, treating the possibility as a casual invitation rather than a planned activity, and began cleaning up the scattered paper scraps with the kind of matter-of-fact efficiency that suggested origami sessions were a perfectly normal part of her daily routine. That night, Marcus found David in his room before bedtime for the first time in weeks, the boy sitting at his small desk arranging and rearranging his paper cranes with the kind of absorbed concentration that children bring to treasured possessions. He looked up when his father entered, not speaking but not looking away either, and Marcus took this as an invitation to examine the origami flock more closely. The cranes were imperfect but charming, each one bearing the marks of David's careful efforts and Emma's patient guidance. Marcus found himself remembering Sarah's attempts at various craft projects, her good-natured frustration with activities that required more precision than her enthusiastic nature usually provided. She would have loved Emma's approach to teaching, the way she made learning feel like play and mistakes feel like part of the creative process rather than failures to be corrected. Marcus sat on the edge of David's bed, close enough to examine the paper birds without invading his son's workspace, and found himself genuinely curious about the folding techniques that had produced such intricate results from simple napkins. David seemed pleased by his father's interest, carefully moving the cranes so Marcus could see each one more clearly, his small hands gentle with the delicate paper constructions. They sat together in comfortable silence, father and son sharing space without the tension that had marked their interactions for so long. Marcus didn't try to force conversation or extract promises about tomorrow's activities, he simply existed in his son's presence while David arranged his paper flock with the kind of careful attention that suggested each bird had its own personality and preferred position in the formation. When Marcus finally kissed David goodnight and headed for the door, his son's voice stopped him in the hallway. The words were so quiet that Marcus wasn't sure he had heard them correctly, but when he turned back toward the room, David was looking directly at him with an expression that was tentative but determined. "Thank you for Emma," the boy said, his voice rusty with disuse but clear enough to be unmistakable. "She knows good stories." The words hung in the air between them, the first voluntary sentence David had spoken in 3 years, and Marcus felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't experienced since the night Sarah died. It wasn't the overwhelming relief he had expected to feel when David finally spoke, it was something quieter and more complex, a recognition that healing was happening in ways he hadn't understood or anticipated. Marcus managed to keep his voice steady as he replied that he was glad David liked Emma's stories, that she seemed like someone special who understood important things about books and cranes and taking time with activities that mattered. David nodded seriously, as if this assessment confirmed his own observations about their new caregiver, and then returned his attention to his paper birds with the kind of satisfied concentration that suggested he had accomplished something significant by speaking aloud. That night, Marcus found himself unable to focus on the financial reports that usually occupied his evening hours. Instead, he stood at his office window looking out at the garden where Emma had first approached David with nothing but a book and the patience to read without expecting anything in return. The roses Sarah had planted were beginning their autumn transformation, their blooms smaller but more intensely colored as the season deepened, and the sight of them no longer carried the sharp pain of memory but something softer and more sustainable. He thought about Emma's approach to his son, the way she had understood instinctively that healing couldn't be rushed or forced but had to be allowed to unfold at its own pace. She had created space for David to exist as he was rather than pushing him to become someone else, and in that space, his son had begun to remember how to be curious about the world again. The origami cranes were more than a craft project, Marcus realized. They were a metaphor for transformation, for taking something ordinary and reshaping it into something beautiful through patience and care and attention to detail. Emma had shown David that broken things could be folded into new forms, that the creases and imperfections that came from multiple attempts were part of the story rather than flaws to be hidden or corrected. As Marcus finally turned away from the window and prepared for bed, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow in a way he hadn't in 3 years. Not because he expected dramatic changes or miraculous breakthroughs, but because Emma had shown them all that healing happened in small moments, in shared silence and gentle laughter and the careful folding of paper into shapes that reminded them all that transformation was possible. The house felt different now, not because the silence had been completely broken but because it had been filled with the kind of presence that made quiet feel peaceful rather than empty. Emma had brought something into their home that Marcus was only beginning to understand, the recognition that love could be expressed in ways that didn't require words, and that sometimes the most profound healing happened when people simply chose to exist in each other's presence without demanding anything more than the opportunity to share space and time and the occasional origami crane. In his son's room down the hall, David was falling asleep surrounded by paper birds that would carry him into dreams filled with stories about kingdoms where colors could be restored and silence was a choice rather than a prison. And for the first time in 3 years, Marcus Montgomery allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were going to be okay. The weeks that followed David's first words established a new rhythm in the Montgomery household, one measured not by dramatic breakthroughs but by the accumulation of small moments that suggested healing was taking root in ways no one had anticipated. Emma's presence had shifted from temporary intervention to integral part of their daily existence, and with that shift came a transformation in how the family understood what recovery might look like. Marcus found himself canceling meetings more frequently, drawn home by a curiosity about the quiet magic that seemed to unfold whenever Emma and David occupied the same space. He would arrive to find them in the library, Emma reading aloud while David constructed elaborate structures from building blocks, his small hands moving with purposeful precision as characters from the story seemed to inspire new architectural possibilities. The boys' creations had grown more complex since Emma's arrival, evolving from simple towers to intricate cities complete with bridges and courtyards and hidden passages that suggested his imagination was awakening from its long hibernation. Emma never commented on these constructions directly, but Marcus noticed how she wove descriptions of the buildings and landscapes from her stories to match whatever David was creating, as if the fictional worlds she conjured were designed specifically to accommodate his particular vision of how space and structure should interact. If David was building a castle, Emma's tale would feature fortresses with secret chambers and winding staircases. If his blocks formed a village, her characters would live in small houses with gardens and market squares where neighbors gathered to share news and trade stories of their own. The symbiosis between Emma's storytelling and David's creative play created an atmosphere of collaborative imagination that filled the house with a sense of purpose and possibility that had been absent since Sarah's death. Marcus would stand in doorways watching these interactions, struck by how naturally Emma had adapted her considerable gifts as a storyteller to serve as catalyst for his son's re-emergence into a world where wonder was possible and silence was a choice rather than a prison. It was during one of these observation sessions that Marcus first noticed the notebook Emma carried with her, a worn leather journal that she would pull out during quiet moments to scribble notes in handwriting too small for him to decipher from across rooms. He assumed initially that she was documenting David's progress in the clinical manner that previous caregivers had employed, creating records of verbal responses and behavioral improvements that could be quantified and analyzed. But when he asked Mrs. Chen about the notebook, the housekeeper's response suggested something entirely different. Mrs. Chen had observed Emma using the journal not to record David's actions but to collect fragments of stories that seemed to emerge spontaneously during their time together. Emma would jot down phrases that David repeated from her reading, sketches of the buildings he constructed, bits of conversation that she carried on with herself while tending to household tasks that involved him peripherally. The notebook appeared to be less a clinical record than a creative repository, a place where Emma gathered the raw materials that she would later weave into the personalized narratives that had become the soundtrack to David's gradual reawakening. This discovery prompted Marcus to pay closer attention to the stories Emma chose, and he began to recognize patterns that suggested she was crafting her selections based on careful observation of David's interests and emotional needs rather than relying on generic children's literature or therapeutic texts recommended by professionals. When David spent a morning absorbed in arranging his toy soldiers in elaborate formations, Emma's afternoon story featured a young general who won battles through clever strategy rather than violence, teaching his army to build rather than destroy the kingdoms they encountered. When David seemed particularly quiet and withdrawn, Emma would read tales of underground kingdoms where silence was a form of communication and solitude was celebrated as a path to wisdom rather than evidence of social failure. The sophistication of Emma's approach to narrative therapy became increasingly apparent as Marcus observed how she used stories not to escape reality but to reframe it in ways that allowed David to process his grief and trauma through the safer medium of fictional characters who faced similar challenges. She never drew explicit parallels between David's situation and the dilemmas faced by her protagonists, but the connections were unmistakable to anyone who understood the symbolic language that children use to make sense of experiences too complex for direct discussion. When Emma read about a young prince who ruled a kingdom where no one spoke above a whisper because loud sounds had once brought terrible destruction, David would listen with the kind of intense concentration that suggested he recognized something of his own experience in the character's careful navigation of a world where communication had become dangerous. When she told stories of magical creatures who collected tears in special bottles because sadness was too precious to waste, David would unconsciously touch his own cheeks as if checking whether his grief might also be valuable rather than shameful. The therapeutic power of Emma's storytelling extended beyond the content of individual tales to encompass the entire ritual of shared narrative that she had established as a central feature of David's daily routine. She read to him at breakfast while he ate cereal and contemplated the day ahead, her voice providing gentle structure to the transition from sleep to wakefulness. She told stories during car rides to appointments and errands, transforming mundane journeys into expeditions through landscapes populated by characters who faced similar challenges with courage and creativity. Most importantly, she had instituted a bedtime story tradition that had become the cornerstone of David's evening routine and the foundation for the most significant breakthrough in his healing process. The bedtime stories were different from Emma's daytime reading, more intimate and personal in ways that reflected the vulnerability that darkness brought to the grieving process. These were not the adventure tales that accompanied David's block-building projects or the whimsical fantasies that made car rides pass more quickly. Instead, Emma crafted these evening narratives specifically to address the fears and sadness that tended to surface when David was alone with his thoughts in the quiet hours before sleep. She would arrive at his bedroom door each night at 8 o'clock, carrying a different book in the worn leather journal where she had collected the day's observations and inspirations. David would be waiting for her, already in his pajamas and settled under the covers that Sarah had chosen during their last Christmas together, his expression expectant in ways that suggested Emma's stories had become as essential to his evening routine as brushing his teeth or saying prayers. The ritual of bedtime storytelling had evolved over the weeks since Emma's arrival, developing its own customs and expectations that both she and David honored with the kind of serious attention that children bring to activities that feel genuinely important. David would show Emma any drawings he had completed during the day, and she would incorporate elements from his artwork into the evening's narrative, transforming his crayon sketches of dragons or spaceships into central characters and tales specifically designed to honor his creative contributions. Emma would then settle into the rocking chair that had remained empty since Sarah's death, opening her chosen book but rarely reading directly from the printed pages. Instead, she would use the text as a launching point for stories that seemed to emerge spontaneously from her interaction with David's mood and interests, weaving together elements from multiple sources to create narratives that felt both familiar and entirely new. These bedtime stories became increasingly interactive as David grew more comfortable with Emma's presence and more confident in his ability to participate without fear of saying the wrong thing or revealing too much of his interior emotional landscape. He began offering suggestions for plot developments, whispering ideas about what characters might do next or where adventures might lead, his contributions tentative at first but growing bolder as Emma demonstrated that his ideas were not only welcome but essential to the collaborative creation of their shared fictional worlds. The transformation in David's verbal participation during storytelling sessions represented the most significant progress he had made since Sarah's death, but Marcus recognized that the healing went deeper than simply the return of speech. His son was learning to trust again, not just in Emma's presence but in his own ability to contribute meaningfully to relationships that required emotional investment and creative vulnerability. The bedtime stories had become a safe space where David could experiment with voice and agency, where his ideas mattered and his imagination was celebrated rather than corrected or redirected. Marcus began lingering outside David's bedroom door during these evening sessions, drawn by curiosity about the stories that were having such profound impact on his son's recovery. What he heard challenged his assumptions about children's literature and the therapeutic power of narrative in ways that made him reconsider his own relationship to the stories that had shaped his understanding of loss and resilience. Emma's tales were sophisticated enough to engage adult attention while remaining accessible to a 7-year-old's emotional vocabulary, complex narratives that addressed themes of grief and healing through metaphors that honored the intelligence of young listeners without overwhelming them with psychological concepts beyond their developmental capacity. She told stories of kingdoms where seasons had stopped changing because the ruler was too sad to let time pass, and how a young gardener helped restore the natural cycle by planting flowers that bloomed in colors that had never existed before, creating beauty that honored the past while embracing possibilities for future growth. She crafted tales of magical libraries where books wrote themselves based on the experiences of their readers, and how a young scholar discovered that the most powerful stories were those that transformed pain into wisdom without erasing the truth of what had been lost. Her characters faced challenges that mirrored real-world struggles with depression and trauma, but they did so in contexts that allowed for magical solutions and happy endings that felt earned rather than imposed by adult wishful thinking. The sophistication of Emma's approach to therapeutic storytelling became particularly apparent during a week when David seemed to regress, becoming more withdrawn and less responsive to the routines that had been supporting his gradual reawakening. Marcus had been concerned that the progress they had witnessed was more fragile than he had dared to hope, but Emma's response to David's setback demonstrated the depth of her understanding of trauma recovery and the non-linear nature of healing. Instead of increasing her efforts to engage David or expressing concern about his withdrawal, Emma shifted her storytelling approach to acknowledge and validate the cyclical nature of grief. She began telling stories about characters who needed to retreat periodically into quiet spaces to process their experiences, tales of wise hermits who lived in mountain caves not because they were antisocial but because solitude allowed them to integrate difficult emotions without having to perform recovery for the benefit of others who were uncomfortable with sadness. These stories normalized David's need for emotional space while maintaining the connection that had become central to his healing process. Emma continued her bedtime visits, but she shortened the sessions and focused on narratives that celebrated the courage required to feel difficult emotions rather than stories that pushed toward resolution or growth. She read about brave knights who conquered fear by acknowledging it rather than fighting it, and about magical creatures who gained power by accepting their own darkness rather than pretending to be made only of light. The wisdom of Emma's approach became apparent when David emerged from his temporary retreat with renewed engagement and deeper capacity for emotional expression than he had demonstrated before. The regression had not been a setback but a necessary part of the healing process, a period of consolidation that allowed him to integrate the progress he had made without being overwhelmed by the pace of change. This experience taught Marcus important lessons about the nature of recovery and the difference between therapeutic approaches that prioritized observable progress and those that honored the internal timeline that governed genuine healing. Emma understood that David's recovery would not follow a straight line from silence to speech, from withdrawal to engagement, but would instead proceed through cycles of advance and retreat that reflected the complex work his young psyche was doing to make sense of loss and learn to trust in the possibility of love that would not disappear without warning. The deepening trust between Emma and David created space for more complex forms of communication than the tentative words he had begun offering during storytelling sessions. David started seeking Emma out during times when he felt overwhelmed by emotions he could not yet articulate, standing quietly beside her while she worked in the kitchen or garden until she noticed his presence and made room for his silent companionship. Emma never rushed these moments or tried to extract explanations for David's need for proximity. Instead, she would adjust her activities to accommodate his presence, offering him simple tasks that allowed him to contribute to her work without requiring conversation or emotional disclosure. He might help her sort ingredients for baking projects or hand her tools while she tended Sarah's roses, his participation valued for its own sake rather than as evidence of therapeutic progress. These shared activities became opportunities for the kind of casual conversation that allowed David to practice verbal communication without the pressure of formal interaction. Emma would narrate her work as she performed it, describing the texture of bread dough or the proper technique for pruning rose bushes, her commentary creating space for David to ask questions or offer observations without having to initiate conversation himself. It was during one of these kitchen sessions that David first mentioned his mother directly, a casual reference to how Sarah used to let him help with cookie decorating that emerged naturally from his observation of Emma's technique with royal icing. The comment was delivered without the emotional weight that discussions of Sarah had carried in previous therapeutic contexts, suggesting that David was beginning to integrate his memories of his mother into his current experience rather than holding them apart as too precious or too painful to share. Emma's response to David's mention of his mother demonstrated the intuitive sensitivity that had made her so effective in supporting his recovery. She neither ignored the reference nor made it the focus of therapeutic discussion, but instead asked casual questions about Sarah's baking preferences and cookie decorating style that honored his memories without making them feel like evidence to be analyzed or problems to be solved. This approach allowed David to share stories about his mother in contexts that felt natural and safe, integrating his past experiences with Sarah into his current relationship with Emma without having to choose between honoring his grief and embracing new possibilities for connection. Emma understood that healing did not require David to let go of his love for his mother, but rather to expand his capacity for love to include new relationships that could coexist with rather than replace his attachment to Sarah. The integration of Sarah's memory into David's daily life marked a significant shift in the family's approach to grief and healing. Marcus had spent 3 years trying to protect his son from painful reminders of their loss, removing photographs and avoiding activities that had been central to their life with Sarah. But Emma's approach suggested that healing happened not through avoidance but through the gradual incorporation of loss into a life that continued to hold space for love and growth. This realization prompted Marcus to reconsider his own relationship to Sarah's memory and the ways that his attempts to shield David from pain had also prevented both of them from accessing the comfort that remembrance could provide. He began bringing Sarah's photographs out of storage, placing them in locations throughout the house where they could be encountered naturally rather than sought out deliberately. He started cooking some of Sarah's favorite meals again, sharing stories about her quirky preferences and cooking disasters that made David laugh rather than cry. The return of Sarah's presence to their daily life, mediated through Emma's wisdom about the healing power of integration rather than avoidance, transformed the atmosphere of the Montgomery household in ways that extended beyond David's individual recovery. The house began to feel like a home again rather than a museum of suspended grief, a place where the past could coexist with the present and where love lost could inspire rather than prevent love found. Emma's own response to the integration of Sarah's memory into their family life revealed depths of character that Marcus had not anticipated when he first hired her. She never competed with Sarah's legacy or tried to replace her in David's affections, but instead positioned herself as someone who could help David maintain his connection to his mother while also building new relationships that honored rather than threatened his foundational attachments. This approach required remarkable emotional maturity and self-confidence, qualities that Emma demonstrated through her ability to celebrate Sarah's importance to David without feeling diminished by the comparison. She would encourage David to tell her about traditions he had shared with his mother, then suggest ways they might adapt those activities to their current circumstances that preserve the essential meaning while acknowledging that the form might need to change. When David mentioned that Sarah used to read him a particular bedtime story that had been lost when his collection was reorganized after the funeral, Emma spent her day off searching used bookstores until she found a copy of the missing volume. But instead of simply replacing the lost book, she presented it to David as an opportunity to create new memories that honored his connection to his mother while also acknowledging his relationship with Emma. She suggested that they read the story together, with David helping to tell the parts he remembered and Emma filling in sections that had faded from his memory. This collaborative approach to reclaiming lost narrative created a powerful healing experience that demonstrated how the past could be recovered without trying to recreate it exactly as it had been. The success of this experiment in collaborative storytelling led to other projects that integrated Sarah's legacy into David's current experience. Emma helped him create a scrapbook of his favorite memories with his mother, but instead of treating it as a memorial to be preserved under glass, she encouraged him to add new pages that documented his current experiences and growth. The scrapbook became a living document that demonstrated how love could continue to evolve and deepen even after loss had changed its fundamental circumstances. These projects helped David understand that remembering his mother did not require him to remain frozen in grief, and that growing beyond his initial response to her death did not mean forgetting her or betraying their relationship. Emma had created space for David to be both Sarah's son and his own person, to honor his past while also embracing possibilities for his future. The transformation in David's relationship to his mother's memory had profound effects on Marcus as well, helping him recognize how his own grief had prevented him from supporting his son's healing in ways that might have been more effective than the professional interventions he had funded. Marcus began to understand that David had needed not just clinical treatment but permission to integrate his loss into a life that could hold both sadness and joy, both memory and hope. This recognition prompted Marcus to examine his own approach to grief and healing, leading him to acknowledge that his retreat into work and emotional distance had been as much a form of avoidance as David's retreat into silence. Emma's presence in their home had created opportunities for Marcus to witness alternative approaches to processing loss, ways of being that honored pain without being paralyzed by it. The evolution of Marcus's understanding of grief and healing was reflected in subtle changes to his own behavior that paralleled the more dramatic transformation occurring in David's emotional life. Marcus began working from home more frequently, not just to observe Emma's interactions with David but because he found himself genuinely interested in participating in the domestic life that she had helped restore to their household. He started joining them for meals more regularly, drawn by David's growing willingness to share stories about his day and curious about the books that Emma was reading aloud during their afternoon sessions. Marcus found himself looking forward to these family meals in ways he had not experienced since Sarah's death, rediscovering pleasure in the simple rituals of shared food and casual conversation that had once been central to their family life. The return of Marcus's engagement with domestic life created opportunities for him to witness Emma's gifts as a caregiver and storyteller in contexts that revealed the depth of her impact on their family's healing. He observed how she managed to be fully present with David while also attending to the practical needs of running a household, how she balanced structure with flexibility in ways that provided security without rigidity. Marcus began to recognize that Emma's approach to caring for David was informed by sophisticated understanding of child development and trauma recovery that had been acquired through experience rather than formal training. Her intuitive responses to David's emotional needs were consistently more effective than the interventions recommended by the specialists Marcus had consulted, suggesting that healing sometimes required heart more than expertise. This recognition prompted Marcus to reconsider his assumptions about professional qualifications and the sources of wisdom that could support recovery from loss and trauma. Emma's success with David had been achieved not through implementation of therapeutic protocols but through her capacity for genuine relationship and her gift for creating narratives that made sense of senseless loss. The growing appreciation that Marcus felt for Emma's contributions to their family's healing was complicated by his awareness that his feelings toward her were evolving beyond professional gratitude towards something more personal and complex. He found himself looking forward to her arrival each morning and reluctant to see her leave each evening, drawn by qualities that extended beyond her effectiveness as David's caregiver to encompass her warmth as a person and her wisdom as someone who understood suffering without being destroyed by it. These developing feelings created internal conflict for Marcus, who had assumed that his capacity for romantic love had been permanently damaged by Sarah's death and the grief that had followed. He had not anticipated that healing might include the possibility of new love, and he struggled with whether such feelings represented growth or betrayal of his continuing love for his deceased wife. Emma seemed unaware of the complexity of Marcus's emotional response to her presence, maintaining the professional boundaries that had characterized their relationship since her arrival while also demonstrating genuine care for both David and Marcus that extended beyond contractual obligations. She remembered Marcus's preferences for coffee and adjusted her cooking to accommodate his dietary restrictions, small gestures that suggested she saw him as a person rather than simply her employer, but she never crossed the lines that separated personal relationship from professional service. The tension between Marcus's growing feelings for Emma and his uncertainty about whether such emotions were appropriate or reciprocated was heightened by his observation of the deep bond that had developed between Emma and David. His son's attachment to Emma was obvious and profound, extending beyond dependence on her caregiving to encompass genuine affection that Marcus had not seen David demonstrate toward anyone since Sarah's death. David sought Emma's approval for his creative projects and looked to her for comfort when he felt sad or overwhelmed, responses that indicated he had come to trust her not just as a source of practical support but as someone who could be counted on for emotional understanding and acceptance. The depth of David's attachment to Emma made Marcus acutely aware that any romantic relationship between them would have implications that extended beyond their personal feelings to encompass David's need for stability and continuity in his primary relationships. This recognition led Marcus to suppress his developing feelings for Emma, convinced that pursuing a romantic relationship would risk the therapeutic gains that David had achieved through their professional arrangement. He told himself that David's healing was more important than any personal happiness he might find with Emma, and he maintained strict emotional boundaries that prevented him from expressing or acting on his attraction to her. The internal conflict created by Marcus's suppressed feelings for Emma was intensified by his observation of her interactions with other people who entered their domestic sphere. When the heating system malfunctioned and required extensive repairs, Marcus watched Emma's easy conversations with the technicians who spent several days working in their home, her natural warmth and humor creating the kind of casual social connection that Marcus had forgotten how to maintain since Sarah's death. Emma's social ease reminded Marcus of qualities he had once possessed but seemed to have lost during the years of grief and professional focus that had followed Sarah's death. She demonstrated that it was possible to be simultaneously serious about important work and lighthearted about daily interactions, to care deeply about healing without losing the capacity for joy and spontaneity that made relationships sustainable over time. These observations prompted Marcus to acknowledge that his attraction to Emma was based on more than physical appeal or gratitude for her work with David, but encompassed genuine admiration for her character and her approach to life. She represented possibilities for personal growth and emotional healing that Marcus had not imagined were available to him, ways of being that honored loss without being defined by it. The complexity of Marcus's feelings toward Emma was further complicated by signs that David had begun to think of her not just as a caregiver but as a potential permanent member of their family. The boy had started including Emma in drawings that depicted their household, positioning her alongside Marcus and himself in ways that suggested he was imagining futures that included her ongoing presence rather than eventual departure. These artistic representations of family structure forced Marcus to confront questions about Emma's long-term role in their lives that extended beyond the immediate needs that had prompted her hiring. David's recovery had progressed to the point where he might not require the intensive support that had initially justified Emma's employment, but his emotional attachment to her suggested that her departure might create new trauma even as her presence had healed old wounds. The question of Emma's permanent place in their family became more pressing when David began asking direct questions about whether she would always live with them, inquiries that revealed his anxiety about the possibility of another important person disappearing from his life without warning. Marcus realized that David's healing had created new vulnerabilities that required careful consideration of how to provide stability without making promises that circumstances might prevent him from keeping. Emma's response to David's questions about her future with their family demonstrated the same wisdom that had characterized her approach to his healing throughout their time together. She neither made commitments she might not be able to honor nor dismissed his concerns as unimportant, but instead acknowledged that questions about the future were natural and important while emphasizing that her current commitment to him was solid and reliable. She explained to David that families could take many different forms and that love between people did not require specific legal or living arrangements to be real and lasting. Emma helped David understand that her care for him was not dependent on her employment status or residential situation, but was based on genuine affection that would continue regardless of changes in their circumstances. This approach helped David develop more sophisticated understanding of relationship stability that was based on emotional connection rather than physical proximity, a crucial lesson for a child whose experience of loss had made him hypersensitive to any signs that important people might disappear. Emma's teaching about the nature of lasting love provided David with conceptual tools for managing anxiety about abandonment while also preparing him for the reality that relationships inevitably involve change and adaptation over time. The success of Emma's approach to David's questions about permanence and stability created space for more complex conversations about family structure and the different ways that people could be important to each other. David began expressing curiosity about Emma's own family and background, questions that she answered with the same honesty and age-appropriate detail that characterized all of her interactions with him. Emma shared stories about her childhood in East Boston, describing the small apartment where she had lived with her parents and younger brother, the community center where she had first discovered her love of storytelling, and the teachers who had recognized her potential and encouraged her educational aspirations. These personal revelations helped David understand that Emma had her own history of relationships and experiences that had shaped who she was, expanding his conception of her beyond her role in his life to encompass her identity as a complete person. The sharing of personal history between Emma and David created opportunities for deeper connection that transcended the therapeutic relationship that had initially brought them together. David began asking Emma to tell him stories not just from books but from her own life, curious about her experiences growing up in a different kind of family and neighborhood than his own. These autobiographical narratives provided David with models for resilience and growth that were grounded in real experience rather than fictional adventure, helping him understand that the challenges he faced were shared by other people who had found ways to create meaningful lives despite difficult circumstances. Emma's stories about her own father's death when she was 12 gave David a framework for understanding that grief was a normal response to loss that could coexist with happiness and hope. The deepening personal relationship between Emma and David created new dynamics in the family that required Marcus to reconsider his assumptions about professional boundaries and the distinction between therapeutic intervention and genuine human connection. It became clear that Emma's effectiveness with David was based not on professional techniques but on her capacity for authentic relationship, her ability to see David as a complete person rather than a collection of symptoms to be treated. This recognition prompted Marcus to acknowledge that what David needed was not continued therapeutic intervention but ongoing relationship with someone who understood and accepted him, someone who could provide both practical support and emotional connection as he continued to grow and develop. Emma had demonstrated that she could fulfill this role in ways that supported David's healing while also honoring his autonomy and individual identity. The question of how to formalize Emma's permanent role in their family became more pressing as David's recovery progressed and the initial reasons for her employment evolved into something more complex and lasting. Marcus found himself imagining scenarios in which Emma remained part of their lives not as hired help but as chosen family, arrangements that would provide David with the stability he needed while also acknowledging the deep relationships that had developed between all three of them. These imaginings forced Marcus to confront his own feelings about Emma and the possibility that his attraction to her might be reciprocated, that their family's healing might include the development of romantic relationship alongside the parental and caregiving bonds that had already been established. The complexity of navigating personal feelings within the context of David's needs created challenges that Marcus had never anticipated when he first hired Emma to help with his son's recovery. The resolution of these challenges would require conversations between Marcus and Emma about their feelings and intentions, discussions that could not be postponed indefinitely without creating uncertainty that might undermine the stability that David had worked so hard to achieve. The time was approaching when the family would need to make decisions about their future that acknowledged both the healing that had occurred and the new possibilities that such healing had created. The crisis came on a Wednesday morning in December when Emma didn't arrive at her usual time. Marcus waited until 9:30 before calling her number, concern growing with each unanswered ring. By 10 o'clock, David had noticed her absence and begun pacing the house with the kind of restless energy that Marcus hadn't seen since the early days of his son's trauma recovery. The boy kept checking the windows that faced the street, his small frame rigid with anxiety that seemed to compress the air around him. Marcus tried to maintain normal routines, but David's distress was infectious, filling the house with tension that made concentration impossible. When Emma's phone continued going straight to voicemail, Marcus made the decision to drive to her apartment in East Boston, bringing David along because leaving him at home seemed crueler than exposing him to whatever emergency had prevented Emma from coming to work. The drive across the city took them through neighborhoods that Marcus rarely visited, working-class areas where triple-deckers lined narrow streets and corner stores advertised lottery tickets in both English and Spanish. David pressed his face to the window, watching the urban landscape change from the manicured suburbs of his daily experience to the grittier reality of Emma's world, his expression thoughtful in ways that suggested he was beginning to understand that Emma had a life beyond their house that involved different challenges and responsibilities. Emma's building was a converted Victorian that had been divided into small apartments, its paint peeling and front steps worn smooth by decades of foot traffic. Marcus had never visited Emma at home, and seeing the modest circumstances of her living situation made him acutely aware of the economic distance between their worlds and the presumption involved in expecting her to prioritize their needs over her own family obligations. The woman who answered Emma's door was clearly her sister, sharing the same dark eyes and expressive features but wearing the exhausted expression of someone dealing with crisis. She introduced herself as Carmen and explained that Emma had been at the hospital all night with their mother, who had suffered what appeared to be a heart attack during the early hours of Tuesday morning. Emma hadn't left the hospital since the ambulance arrived, hadn't eaten or slept, and had been too focused on coordinating their mother's care to think about calling work or managing any other aspects of her normal routine. The information hit Marcus like a physical blow, not just because it explained Emma's absence but because it revealed the depth of his family's dependence on her and his failure to understand the pressures she faced outside their insulated world. He had hired Emma to care for David, but he had never considered what would happen when she needed care herself, never established protocols for emergencies that might prevent her from prioritizing their needs over her own family's crises. David's reaction to the news about Emma's mother was immediate and intense, tears filling his eyes as he processed the information that someone important to Emma was in danger. His response revealed the extent to which he had internalized Emma's well-being as connected to his own security, demonstrating how completely he had come to depend on her presence for his sense of stability and safety. Carmen invited them to come to the hospital, explaining that Emma would want to know they were thinking of her even though she was too overwhelmed to maintain contact with the outside world. The drive to Boston Medical Center gave Marcus time to recognize how completely Emma had become integrated into their daily lives and how unprepared he was to manage David's emotional needs without her support and guidance. The pediatric wing of the hospital was familiar territory for David, who had spent countless hours in similar corridors during the months following his mother's death when Marcus had pursued every possible therapeutic intervention. But returning to a medical environment in the context of Emma's crisis rather than his own treatment created different associations, connecting his experience of loss and fear with Emma's current vulnerability in ways that threatened to trigger regression in his recovery. They found Emma in the cardiac unit waiting room, curled up in an uncomfortable chair that she had clearly been occupying for many hours. Her usually neat appearance was disheveled, her clothes wrinkled and her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail that suggested she had been running her hands through it repeatedly. She looked smaller than Marcus remembered, diminished by exhaustion and worry in ways that reminded him of his own appearance during the worst days following Sarah's death. When Emma saw David, her composure cracked completely, tears flowing as she pulled him into a hug that seemed to restore some essential part of herself that had been depleted by hours of medical uncertainty and family responsibility. David clung to her with desperate intensity, his small body shaking with relief that she was physically present even though the circumstances were frightening and unfamiliar. Marcus watched their reunion with emotions that were complex and overwhelming, recognizing that his feelings for Emma extended far beyond professional gratitude to encompass something deeper and more personal than he had allowed himself to acknowledge. Seeing her vulnerable and exhausted made him want to protect and care for her in ways that had nothing to do with her role in David's recovery and everything to do with his growing love for her as a person who deserved support and tenderness during her own times of crisis. The conversation with Emma about her mother's condition revealed the extent of her family's financial struggles and the impossible choices that medical emergencies created for working-class families without adequate insurance or savings. Emma's mother needed surgery that would require weeks of recovery, during which she would be unable to work her job as a hotel housekeeper. Carmen worked as a cashier at a grocery store, earning barely enough to cover her own expenses, let alone support their mother through an extended illness. Emma was clearly calculating whether she could afford to take unpaid leave to care for her mother, her expression revealing the conflict between her professional obligations and her family responsibilities. Marcus could see her trying to figure out how to manage both sets of demands without failing the people who depended on her, the impossible mathematics of working-class life where every decision involved sacrificing one essential need to meet another. The solution that emerged from Marcus's recognition of Emma's dilemma was both practical and transformative, addressing her immediate crisis while also creating space for conversations about their long-term relationship that had been building beneath the surface of their professional arrangement. Marcus offered to pay for Emma's mother's medical expenses and to provide Emma with paid leave to manage her care, proposals that removed the financial pressure while acknowledging that family emergencies took precedence over work obligations. But beyond the practical support, Marcus's response to Emma's crisis revealed the depth of his emotional investment in her well-being and his desire to be someone she could depend on during difficult times rather than simply someone who employed her services. He found himself speaking not as an employer offering benefits but as someone who cared about Emma personally and wanted to ensure that she had the resources she needed to take care of her family without sacrificing her own financial security. Emma's response to Marcus's offers was complex, gratitude mixed with pride and uncertainty about accepting help that went far beyond professional courtesy. She had spent her adult life managing crises independently, supporting her family through her own efforts and refusing assistance that might create obligations or dependencies she couldn't control. Marcus's generosity was overwhelming not just in its scope but in its implications, suggesting a level of personal concern that transformed the nature of their relationship in ways that required careful consideration. The days that followed established new patterns of interaction between Marcus, Emma, and David that blurred the boundaries between professional service and personal relationship in ways that made their evolving feelings impossible to ignore. Marcus found himself visiting the hospital regularly, bringing David to spend time with Emma and her mother, creating opportunities for their families to interact in contexts that had nothing to do with employment or caregiving arrangements. David formed an immediate bond with Emma's mother, despite her weakened condition and the intimidating medical equipment that surrounded her hospital bed. The elderly woman responded to David's gentle presence with warmth that transcended language barriers, speaking to him in rapid Spanish that he didn't understand but seemed to find comforting rather than confusing. Emma translated their conversations, creating trilingual exchanges that filled the sterile hospital room with laughter and connection. These hospital visits revealed aspects of Emma's character that Marcus had not previously observed, her tenderness with her mother and her ability to maintain hope and humor despite the seriousness of the medical situation. He watched her navigate complex conversations with doctors and insurance representatives, advocating for her mother's care with intelligence and persistence that demonstrated skills he hadn't recognized when he thought of her primarily as David's caregiver. The crisis also created opportunities for Marcus to support Emma in ways that went beyond financial assistance to encompass emotional presence and practical help with the mundane tasks that medical emergencies generate. He drove her to and from the hospital when she was too exhausted to manage public transportation safely, brought her coffee and meals when she forgot to eat, and sat with her during the long hours when medical procedures prevented family visits. These acts of service felt natural and necessary to Marcus, expressions of care that emerged from genuine affection rather than obligation or guilt. He found himself thinking about Emma's needs throughout his own days, planning his schedule around her availability and preferences in ways that had nothing to do with David's requirements and everything to do with his desire to be helpful and supportive during her family's crisis. David's response to the hospital visits and the integration of Emma's family into their daily routines revealed his remarkable capacity for empathy and his understanding that relationships involved mutual care and support rather than one-sided service provision. He created drawings for Emma's mother and learned simple Spanish phrases that he could use to communicate directly with her, his efforts to connect across language and cultural barriers demonstrating emotional intelligence that amazed the adults who witnessed his interactions. The experience of caring for Emma's mother together created a sense of shared purpose and family identity that extended beyond the original parameters of their arrangement. Marcus, Emma, and David began functioning as a coordinated unit, making decisions collectively and supporting each other through the emotional challenges that medical crises invariably generate. The artificial boundaries between employer and employee dissolved under the pressure of genuine crisis and mutual care. Emma's mother's recovery progressed slowly but steadily, her condition stabilizing enough to allow discharge from the hospital after 2 weeks of intensive treatment. The transition to home care created new challenges and opportunities for their extended family unit, as Emma needed to balance her mother's needs with her continued work with David and her own requirements for rest and recuperation after weeks of crisis management. Marcus's response to these challenges was to propose a solution that acknowledged the permanent changes that the crisis had created in their relationships and the impossibility of returning to purely professional arrangements that ignored their personal feelings and family bonds. He suggested that Emma move into the Montgomery house with her mother, creating a living arrangement that would allow her to provide the care her mother needed while maintaining her work with David and eliminating the financial pressures that made such comprehensive care otherwise impossible. The proposal was radical in its implications, transforming their house from a workplace into a genuine multi-generational home where Emma's family would be integrated into their daily lives as residents rather than visitors. Marcus presented the idea not as charity or employment benefit but as a practical solution that served everyone's needs while acknowledging the reality that their lives had become intertwined in ways that transcended professional relationships. Emma's response to the invitation revealed her own recognition that their arrangement had evolved beyond employment into something more complex and lasting. She accepted not just the practical benefits of the living situation but the implications of permanent integration into the Montgomery family structure, a decision that required courage and trust in the still undefined relationship that was developing between herself and Marcus. The logistics of combining households created opportunities for conversations about expectations and boundaries that had been avoided during the months when their relationship remained nominally professional. Emma and Marcus found themselves discussing everything from domestic responsibilities to child-rearing philosophies, negotiations that revealed their compatibility in areas that extended far beyond Emma's qualifications as David's caregiver. These conversations also created space for more personal discussions about their feelings for each other and their hopes for the future of their relationship. Marcus finally found the courage to acknowledge that his feelings for Emma had grown beyond professional appreciation to encompass genuine love and desire for permanent partnership. Emma's response revealed that she had been struggling with similar feelings, torn between her affection for Marcus and David and her uncertainty about whether romantic involvement with her employer was appropriate or sustainable. The resolution of their romantic tension came through David's direct intervention, his childlike wisdom cutting through the adult complexities that had been preventing them from acknowledging their feelings openly. During one of their evening storytelling sessions, David asked Emma to tell him a story about a family where everyone loved each other but was too scared to say so, his request revealing his understanding of the emotional dynamics that were shaping his daily experience. Emma's response to David's request was to craft a story about a kingdom where people have forgotten how to express love directly, communicating only through acts of service and care that left everyone uncertain about their relationships and afraid of rejection. The tale's resolution involved a young prince who broke the silence by simply stating his feelings honestly, creating permission for the adults around him to acknowledge emotions they had been hiding from each other and themselves. The story served as both entertainment and therapeutic intervention, giving Marcus and Emma language for discussing their feelings while also reassuring David that his own emotional needs and observations were valid and important. The evening concluded with Marcus and Emma acknowledging their love for each other and their desire to create a permanent family structure that honored their relationship while maintaining David's security and Emma's mother's care needs. The transformation from professional arrangement to genuine family required adjustments that extended beyond emotional acknowledgement to encompass practical changes in their living situation and legal relationships. Marcus began the process of formalizing his commitment to Emma through marriage proposal that acknowledged both his romantic love and his desire to create legal protections for her and her mother that would ensure their security regardless of future circumstances. Emma's acceptance of Marcus's proposal was complicated by her awareness that marriage would change not just her relationship with him but her entire social and economic position in ways that required careful consideration. She had spent her adult life as a working-class woman supporting her family through her own labor, and becoming wealthy through marriage created identity challenges that she needed to process with the same thoughtfulness she brought to all major life decisions. The engagement period allowed Emma and Marcus to work through these challenges while also planning a wedding that would honor both their backgrounds and their values. They chose a ceremony that combined elements from both their cultural traditions, creating celebration that acknowledged Emma's Latino heritage while also respecting the more formal customs that Marcus's social position required. David's role in the wedding planning revealed his complete embrace of Emma as his new mother and his excitement about the formalization of relationships that had been developing for months. He insisted on participating in every aspect of the ceremony, from choosing flowers to writing his own contribution to the wedding vows, his enthusiasm serving as reminder that their love story was fundamentally about family creation rather than just romantic partnership. The wedding itself was both intimate and meaningful, held in the garden where Emma had first read stories to David and where Sarah's roses continued to bloom in testament to the continuity of love across different relationships and life phases. The ceremony acknowledged both the joy of new beginnings and the grief that had brought them together, creating space for complex emotions while celebrating the healing and growth that had emerged from their shared experiences. Emma's mother, recovered enough to participate in the celebration, gave a speech in Spanish that Emma translated for the assembled guests, sharing her gratitude for the love and support that had sustained her family through crisis and her joy in witnessing her daughter's happiness. Her presence at the wedding symbolized the integration of their families and the success of their unconventional approach to building relationships that honored existing obligations while creating space for new love. David's contribution to the wedding ceremony was a story that he told instead of traditional vows, a narrative about a prince who lived in a castle that was too quiet until a magical storyteller arrived and filled it with words that brought everything to life. His story acknowledged the transformation that Emma's presence had created in their home while also expressing his own commitment to their new family structure and his excitement about their shared future. The conclusion of David's wedding story served as epilogue for their entire journey from grief and silence to healing and love, his words capturing the essence of their transformation in language that was both childlike and profound. He spoke of homes that became happy when people chose to love each other, of stories that came true when people were brave enough to believe in them, and of families that could be created through choice and care rather than just birth and blood. As the wedding celebration concluded and their guests departed, Marcus, Emma, and David found themselves alone in the garden where their story had begun, surrounded by the evidence of their journey and the promise of their future together. The roses that Sarah had planted continued to bloom, their beauty enhanced rather than diminished by the new love that had taken root in the same soil, and the tire swing that had once been a symbol of David's isolation had become a place of joy and laughter where multiple generations gathered to share stories and create memories. The transformation of the Montgomery household from a monument to grief into a living home filled with multiple generations and diverse cultures represented the complete success of their unconventional approach to healing and family creation. Emma's presence had catalyzed changes that extended far beyond David's recovery to encompass Marcus's emotional growth and the creation of new traditions that honored both their past experiences and their current relationships. David's final words as they prepared to enter their house as a newly constituted family captured the essence of their journey and the hope that sustained their future together. Looking up at Marcus and Emma with the confidence of a child who knew himself to be completely loved and securely held, he declared that their house was no longer too quiet, that it was filled with exactly the right amount of voices and stories and laughter to make everyone who lived there happy. The boy who had spent 3 years in silence had not only found his voice again but had learned to use it to express gratitude, love, and hope for continued growth and connection. His transformation from traumatized child to confident family member represented the success of Emma's approach to healing and the power of love expressed through patient presence, creative storytelling, and unwavering commitment to seeing and honoring the complete person within every individual who has experienced loss and trauma. As they crossed the threshold into their shared home, Marcus carried the knowledge that their love story would continue to unfold through the daily acts of care and attention that sustain all meaningful relationships over time. Emma brought her gifts for storytelling and her understanding that healing happens through connection rather than isolation. David contributed his hard-won wisdom that families can be created through choice and sustained through love that expresses itself in words and silence, in presence and patience, in stories that help everyone understand that transformation is possible and hope is always justified when people choose to care for each other with courage and creativity and complete commitment to shared growth and mutual support. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.